Hey everyone! Before we begin today's episode, I would like to remind you guys again to please check out some of my other YouTube channels in the description down below. I have a Star Wars Battlefront 2 Classic Focus channel where I review custom maps and mods on the Battlefront Max channel. I do gaming reviews on the Kanoa Reviews channel, and have also recently started a Minecraft adventure channel where I play through classic adventures with friends. You can find the links in the description, and please subscribe to those channels if you like what you see. World War III was upon us. Over the past few years, China had spread out its web of influence on multiple continents. Originally, the plan was to unleash a large-scale conflict by 2025. But a few influential figures in the Greek and Turkish areas had spearheaded the war to 2022. It was a war between NATO and the Shanghai Pact that had now control over countries in Africa and South America as well. The current existing front was at Turkey, despite some battles still happening on various Greek islands. For the moment, an invasion force into Turkey would still be on hold until more reinforcements were battle ready. Countries like the US would ship over units, but at the same time would also take care of the war in South America. Britain was the first nation to attempt an invasion on Turkey. When they landed, the Turkish rained down hell upon them. It was a bloody massacre, and the invasion would soon be halted. In Greece, a mixture of armies from all over the globe were fighting together against the Greek forces. They were accompanied by Greek resistance fighters, who did not want any part in the Shanghai Pact whatsoever. Despite the NATO armies being able to win all battles, the overall campaign was slow due to the many small islands one had to traverse, and also the rocky terrain. It was very easy to resupply troops though through the waters, and spirits and morale were high for the troops from all over Europe. In China, there was still a conflict brewing that was labeled by some as a civil war. Several harbor towns rebelled after the incredible seawall was erected all alongside the coast. Tens of thousands of Chinese clashed with the government armies, all the while information had leaked that multiple cruisers and destroyers were heading towards the Chinese Sea. The first few weeks of the war were devastating. Artillery and heavy weaponry were used, resulting in tens of thousands of dead on both sides. Europe was currently the main battlefield, and so China did not suffer that much yet. They had sent a few thousand troops to aid the Turkish and other allies, but the overall might of the army still stayed in China itself. With the front laying on the border of the European Union, it was easy for many European countries to move troops towards the battlefield. Many of the soldiers were young and hungry to see some action. Depending on the country of origins, the trip towards the battlefield could last up to 1.5 weeks. They were eager to hear any news from the front and imagined what it would be like when they would get there. The British troops that had set foot on Turkish ground were now also reinforced by other European soldiers in the hopes to find an opening somewhere and move deeper into enemy territory. From satellite images, one could see just how many ships and men were being sent out from America to fight against the Shanghai Pact in both Europe and South America. Soon, there would be two fronts, and it was but a question if any side could find an opportunity to present itself here. The battles in Greece escalated as more and more NATO units joined the fight. Often pincer-type attacks were used, evidently crushing the Greeks who fought valiantly. The fighting on Greece, which would still last months, would surely give the Turkish time to set up more defenses and make it really difficult for NATO to successfully invade their nation. By November, the battle for the Sea of China had indeed been going underway. Battles happened over incredible distances, often not seeing the enemy ships with the naked eye. At the same time, there was a constant battle happening underwater with submarines from multiple nations. Bombardments on coastal towns with fighters were attempted too, but the seawall created in the past years was too sturdy and its AA artillery too brutal to do any significant damage. In South America, the battle had begun as well. Currently, it was only America that partook in this conflict on the NATO side, but they managed to take control of a large part during the initial invasions. The problem was, however, the terrain itself. Thick jungle forests were a nightmare to traverse with their armor, and the South American armies that fought for the Shanghai Pact resorted to guerrilla tactics from olden times. Battles were often swift and brief, but left many dead in its wake. The battles in the city were much more in the favor of the US forces. The US also tried to come ashore in the Middle East to maybe create a flanking maneuver and attack from a different angle to relieve some pressure from the front in Turkey. This would be a common occurrence where multiple invasion points were initiated to divide the armies of the Shanghai Pact and forcing them to thin out. Currently, the front at the Greek and Turkish border was a bloodbath and hardly moved. Artillery bombardments from both sides day and night, leaving entire towns and cities devastated in the aftermath. And so as 2023 began, the world was still intertwined in a large conflict that spanned multiple continents. There were those who were afraid that this war would last longer than the Second World War, but others were of the opinion it would end faster, especially with nuclear weapons being a possible threat. But at the moment, no side had used a nuke yet, for the simple reason that once a nation would, the retaliation would soon follow, and this would mean unacceptable losses for all sides. Tens of thousands of US soldiers were fighting in the jungles and towns near the northern coast of South America. The Surinamese terrain was harsh, favoring those who had lived there all their lives, and fights in the jungle were notorious amongst the US soldiers. No one was excited when they were sent on another patrol, and they even compared it to the Vietnam days, whereas others mentioned it was worse than that. By now, they were also reinforced by other NATO countries, which gave some necessary soothing and friendly conversation when they had downtime. Those fighting for the same side exchanged gifts, cigarettes, and stories from home, warming the hearts of many that had turned stone cold over the past gruesome weeks. By February of 2023, the news arrived that Suriname had capitulated and conquered by the US. This came as no surprise, as the invasion points were expected to be taken quickly anyway with the force that was being used. It was now a question of the infantry being able to expand deeper and south towards Brazil, where the fight would become even harsher in the Amazon and would last for a very long time. By now, the death toll had increased even more and exceeded over 250,000 in total. For the past months, it was mostly the US that was suffering due to their battles fought in South America. The soldiers stationed in Europe heard horror stories about the men and women fighting over there, and many thanked God itself they were not chosen to be over on the other side of the globe. China by now was still unfazed. Their units stationed in Turkey and in the Middle East were having a harder time, but propaganda programs made sure that the home front heard of their valiant stories and victories. China's seawall still stood as mighty as ever. By now, Greece had been entirely taken over by the NATO forces. Despite infrastructure seemingly being a nightmare with all the small islands, it did offer great protection for bases and supply depots. A complicated model of codes and code names were used to identify the location of each area and the movement of units, both in manpower or resources, to new ones. The battle in the north of South America had widened, with the US achieving victories and gaining some incredible ground after it was greenlit to devastate the dense forests so that infantry and armor could roll through. Reinforcements were brought with helicopters in this environment, fueling the image of the Vietnam War era even more. That's why the front in South America got the nickname Unfortunate Son on the regular infantrymen who were stationed in Europe. In the south of Brazil, multiple invasions had been pulled off successfully as well. The forces here would move up north to link up with the forces that arrived to the coasts elsewhere. The Chinese that rebelled against their government had been dealt with by now, and all resources could now go towards keeping the seawall protected from the many artillery bombardments it had to withstand on a daily basis. The war by now had been going on for about a year, and had already claimed about 500,000 dead. On no front, it seemed like the battles were going to stop anytime soon, and in some areas like Europe, so little progress had been made in a year against Turkey that people were afraid that this might be the longest war yet.